took Lucky home, and this was the beginning of an absolute transformation in Matt's sad life. Have you ever had that one moment in your life when everything changed? When all of a sudden everything was different? In this video, I'm going to tell you the story of Matt and his dog named Lucky. Hi, my name is Reverend Bill, and in this video, I'm going to tell you about how Matt's life was changed thanks to his dog. You see, Matt was a lonely man who had alienated most of the people he worked with and all of his former friends. But then one day he adopted a dog named Lucky, a stray dog who would completely change his life forever. Matt was an average young man, worked hard every day to eke out a living for himself. He had just graduated from college in his hometown of Maple Grove, and finally, after a long and exhausting search, he landed a good job at his local bank. Since his degree was in accounting, his newfound job was a perfect fit for his skills and his talent. Although Matt was young, bright, and working now in a good job, he had been and he still was very self-centered and smug about everything. And as a result, he'd become a bit of a loner, since none of his so-called friends would put up with him very long, with his boastful and arrogant attitude about almost everything. Matt would always mutter and say, as he sat home alone every night, that his friends were just losers who would never be as successful as he was. Matt's motto in life, which he let everyone know, was, "I'm going to get to the top in life, and I don't care who I step on my way up." And the older Matt got, the more resentful and angry he became. You could feel his bitterness toward people who did not see life his way. One afternoon, after a long day at the bank and not wanting to spend one more weekend alone, Matt drove to the local animal shelter, and he looked for a pet. He figured if no person would befriend him, maybe a dog would become his best friend. Matt had always had trouble getting along with others. He never really fit in with any of the kids at school, and he always felt a little awkward around people. You see, growing up was no picnic for Matt. Matt was an only child, and his folks never held back the fact that they really wanted a girl instead of him all along. And they hardly ever showed Matt any affection. And when they talked at him, or more likely gave orders to him, they were rude and abusive. And this is why Matt always put up such a brash front in order to hide his fears and his weaknesses around other people. He simply didn't know how to relate to people in a healthy way. And as Matt got older, he found that he preferred to spend his time alone as a lonely and depressed person. He'd rather be lonely and alone than mixed up with another person he didn't enjoy. Finally, Matt couldn't take the isolation any longer. He decided that day to go to the animal shelter on the outskirts of town and see what he could find. Well, it didn't take long for him to find the perfect companion, a small mutt who had been abandoned by his previous owner. As the shelter owner described this little dog to Matt, it sounded exactly like she was describing him to another person. She told Matt that this little scruffy dog had been abandoned on the side of the road and left all alone to suffer and fend for itself and die. She said he seemed to be so hungry for affection that every day when she'd walk by his cage, he would run to the cage door, wag his tail rapidly, and plead at her with his eager eyes for a hug and a pat on the head. Matt realized that he and Lucky could be brothers for how she described the poor little dog. Matt took Lucky home, and this was the beginning of an absolute transformation over Matt's sad life. And for the next 3 years, Lucky was by Matt's side through thick and thin. He was there when Matt got promoted at work and brought home pizza and soda for them to enjoy. And Lucky was there when Matt's parents passed away. He was even there when Matt fell down and broke his leg and had to spend 6 weeks healing at home in bed. Matt soon realized the beautiful truth that Lucky loved him no matter how he acted or even no matter what he said and did. Matt was beginning to understand what unconditional love was all about. Lucky was truly Matt's best friend, and as often is the case, when we grow close to our furry friends, Lucky slowly but surely started to soften Matt up. Lucky was truly a blessing in Matt's life. He was always there for Matt when he needed him, and he taught Matt some important lessons about loving kindness, unconditional love, and acceptance. One of the most important lessons that Lucky taught Matt was about being alone. Matt had always been a bit afraid of being alone, but Lucky showed him that it wasn't anything wrong to be afraid of. In fact, Matt learned that being alone gave him time to meditate, to think about his life, and to watch Lucky show him how to be kind. Lucky also taught Matt about sacrifice. He showed Matt that sometimes you have to give up something you want in order to help someone else you care about. And finally, Lucky taught Matt about the power of unconditional love. No matter what happened, Lucky always loved Matt unconditionally. He was a true friend. And Matt will never forget the lessons he learned from Lucky. Many, many years later, as Lucky and Matt were growing older together, Matt lay quietly in his bed in the darkness of his room, petting Lucky softly as he slept peacefully beside his human, as he had done every night for all these years. Matt began to recount all the important life lessons he had learned from his best friend, Lucky. Matt recalled how when he was feeling down, Lucky was always there to make him laugh and feel loved. He remembered how when he was feeling lonely, Lucky would always be there to provide companionship, or wag his tail and lick him. And he remembered how when he was struggling, Lucky would always be there to offer a helping paw. Most of all, Matt remembered how grateful he was to have such a selfless and loyal friend by his side. Though they had been through some tough times together over the years, Matt knew that the blessings of their friendship far outweighed any hardships they may have faced. And as he gazed at Lucky sleeping peacefully beside him, he couldn't help but feel thankful for the love and companionship of his best friend, the one who had been by his side through it all. Matt understood that day what it meant to be loved, and he learned the lessons that while he thought he was rescuing a poor lost dog, this little mutt was really rescuing him from a life of self-imposed emptiness. Matt had finally learned how unfair and unkind he had been to his friends as he was growing up and going through school. He felt ashamed and guilty for the way he treated the new employees at the bank he was now managing over the past 10 years. Matt was not very religious, but that night, in the quiet and subtle darkness of his room, he asked God to forgive him and help him be as kind and loving to others as Lucky was to him. Matt fell asleep as he always did with Lucky cradled in his arms. But little did he know that this night would be the last night he slept in peace next to his beloved Lucky. The very next morning, Matt and Lucky arose as usual and headed out to the front porch to greet the day and plan their activities together. All of a sudden, without any warning, a fire truck, sirens blaring, came rushing down the street right toward Matt's house. The roar of the engine and the sound of the sirens startled Lucky, and he jumped into the air with a start, and he ran straight into the road. By the time Matt had jumped up from his porch chair, it was too late. Lucky had been struck head-on by the fire truck as it sped out of sight down the street. Matt scooped up Lucky, and he carried him back to their home. He carefully climbed the front porch steps, and he laid the now limp body of Lucky down on the small rug by the front door. Matt had been through a lot in his life. He'd had blessings, and he had challenges. He'd been loved, and he'd been alone. But through it all, he always had Lucky. But in this tragic moment, he was facing the hardest test life could bring his way. Lucky was his best friend and his confidant. So as Lucky lay there dying, Matt was devastated. He knew that the time had come to say goodbye. But he wasn't ready. He sat on the porch cradling Lucky, and he cried like a baby. And just before Lucky died, he looked up at Matt, and he licked the tears off of Matt's face. It was a final act of love and devotion that Matt would always remember. Because in that moment he realized that Lucky had given him the greatest gift of all. The knowledge that he was never really alone, and that he was loved forever. And you know what? You never know what really lies around the next corner, or what might sail down your road of life and hit you head on, do you? None of us do. I don't, and I bet you don't either. We can make guesses, and we can hope for only the good stuff to come our way, but life isn't always that way, is it? If we wait and tell ourselves, I'll be nicer tomorrow, or I'll tell so-and-so how much I appreciate them, but I'll do it later, there may never be a tomorrow, or a later may never come. So what do we learn today from the story of Matt and Lucky? We learn that even when things are tough, we always have the potential for love and companionship. We learn that even in our darkest moments, there is always someone who loves us unconditionally. And we learn that sometimes the greatest gifts come from those who are no longer with us. This is Reverend Bill McBride from the Inspiration Story Channel. I hope to see you next time for another story of faith, inspiration, and love. And if you enjoyed this story about Matt and Lucky, please leave me a comment and a like, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my next inspired story next week. Take care. We'll see you in the next video.